Thunder cracked overhead, splitting the blackness with a sharp, rolling boom. Each echo rattled the windows of Caroline's old farmhouse, deep in the wild outskirts of Lexington, Kentucky. The air was thick and electric, heavy with the scent of wet earth and the promise of a winter storm that showed no sign of letting up. Rain hammered the roof in relentless waves, each drop a reminder of how truly alone she was out here. She lay wide awake in her creaking bed, sheets twisted around her legs, her eyes fixed on the wavering shadows cast by the lightning. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept soundly through a night like this. Not since the divorce. Not since the world seemed to crack in two, leaving her clutching at broken pieces and memories that slipped through her fingers like water. The farmhouse, once filled with laughter and music, now echoed with emptiness and her own restless thoughts. From outside came the sharp sound of hooves striking wood, once, twice, then a flurry, urgent and insistent. Caroline sat bolt upright. Sable. The mare had only been with her a few weeks, a last-minute rescue, a big brown presence with dark, intelligent eyes. They'd both been abandoned in their own ways, two solitary souls adrift at the edge of something lost. She pulled on her boots, not bothering with a coat, and hurried out into the storm. The rain was cold and fierce, stinging her face as she sprinted across the yard. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating the world in blue-white flashes. Sable's stable stood at the far end of the property, and as Caroline approached, she could see the mare pacing, nostrils flared, tail whipping with agitation. The horse's hooves slammed the stall door again, another warning, sharper this time, almost as if she was trying to say something. Caroline's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She felt the old fear rising in her chest, the kind that gnawed at the edges of her heart whenever she remembered how empty her bed felt, how quiet the house was at midnight. The storm outside seemed to have gotten inside her, rattling every nerve, pulling every old anxiety to the surface. She fumbled with the latch and stepped inside. Sable's eyes found her instantly, wide and gleaming in the dark. The mare stomped again, shifting her weight restlessly. Caroline reached out a trembling hand, running her palm down the horse's slick neck, whispering nonsense words to try to soothe them both. But Sable wasn't listening. Her whole body was turned, taut and alert. Ears pointed like arrows toward the ancient oak at the edge of the property, a tree older than memory, its bare limbs twisting against the angry sky. "Sable, easy now," Caroline murmured, but the mare pulled away, snorting, still fixated on the tree. A sudden primal dread slithered through Caroline. She turned her eyes to the old oak, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. The lightning came again, lighting the yard with a stark, unforgiving glare. And for a moment she saw it. Something odd. Something not right. The ground at the base of the oak was churned up, fresh earth mounded where there should have only been grass and tangled roots. She hesitated. Every rational part of her wanted to go back inside, lock the door, forget she'd seen anything. But Sable whinnied, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed across the yard and left no room for doubt. Caroline grabbed a flashlight and started toward the tree, each step squishing in the sodden ground. The wind pulled at her hair and lashed her cheeks, and she thought of every ghost story she'd ever heard. "What are you doing?" she thought, but something deeper, a stubborn need to face whatever haunted her life, pushed her forward. She knelt in the mud, hands sinking into the soft earth, digging without thinking. Her fingers found something hard beneath the surface. Wood, cold and damp, maybe a root, maybe a stone. She dug deeper, heart pounding. The ground gave way suddenly, and her hand closed around something metallic, slick with clay. Caroline pulled it out. A rusted old horseshoe, crusted with mud and age. But as she brushed it off, her flashlight beam caught a glint of something else. The corner of a small, battered tin, half buried where the roots twisted like skeletal fingers. She glanced back at Sable, who had come as close as the fence would allow, watching her with an intensity that bordered on human. Caroline's heart hammered. The storm, the horse, the tree. Everything seemed tangled together in a way that made no sense and perfect sense all at once. She reached for the tin, tugging it free. The lid was stuck, but after a moment's work, it popped open. Inside, nestled in mud-stained cloth, were a few folded papers, a faded photograph, and a brooch, silver, tarnished, shaped like a galloping horse. Caroline stared, mouth dry. Lightning flashed, thunder roared. She felt it then, a ripple through the air, like the moment before a race begins or a secret is finally spoken aloud. Sable stamped, restless, as if urging her, "Go on!" Caroline gathered the contents, cradling them close, and hurried back to the barn. The storm howled behind her, but for the first time in months, she felt the faintest flicker of something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. Dawn crept in slowly, gray and cold. The storm's fury reduced to a gentle drizzle that beat it on every surface and soaked the world in quiet unease. Caroline didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on the old tin box and its secrets, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. The farmhouse felt more haunted than ever, each tick of the clock echoing the restless pulse in her chest. As the sky began to lighten, she stood, pulled on her boots, and wrapped herself in her thickest coat. There was work to be done. She stepped outside, Sable close behind her, their breath misting in the chill morning air. The mare nudged her shoulder as they crossed the yard, a silent reassurance. "You're not alone." The storm had left the ground saturated and heavy, each step pulling at Caroline's feet as she made her way back to the ancient oak. The earth still looked freshly disturbed, the grass pressed flat where she'd knelt the night before. Caroline hesitated, gripping the handle of an old shovel she'd pulled from the barn. Her hands shook as she dug, the metal blade biting into the soft ground, turning over clumps of black mud and twisted roots. With each shovelful, her anxiety grew. It felt wrong, like trespassing on someone else's sorrow, but curiosity, old and sharp, pushed her forward. Sable hovered nearby, her ears twitching, her eyes never leaving the tree. At last, the blade struck something solid, a rectangular edge, metal, smeared with mud. Caroline dropped to her knees and dug with her hands, heart pounding. She hauled out an old metal box, heavier than it looked, battered by years of storms and seasons. She wiped away the mud with trembling fingers, her breath catching as the box gave a faint, rusty creak when she pried it open. Inside were the relics of another life, a bundle of yellowed Wapwatu-era love letters, bound together with a ribbon so fragile it crumbled at her touch. Beneath them, a black and white photograph, a young cavalry soldier in uniform, his eyes proud, his posture straight. On the back, in faded ink, Elliot Harmon, 1944. Tucked beside it was a silver brooch, identical to the one she'd found the night before, shaped like a galloping horse. Caroline swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the first letter, the paper so thin it threatened to tear. The words inside were raw, urgent. A woman named Mary writing to her beloved Elliot, begging him to come home, promising to wait beneath the oak tree until her last breath. As Caroline read, her own heartache came flooding back, echoing across the decades. She recognized herself in Mary's desperate hope, her fear of loss, The way love could root itself so deep it left scars that never fully healed. She read the letters one after another, her eyes stinging as the story unfolded in Mary's shaky handwriting. Mary wrote of lonely nights, of praying for news, of the comfort she found beneath the ancient oak. There were hints of secrets, too, of promises made and broken, of something hidden beneath the roots that only Elliot would understand. Caroline pressed the last letter to her chest, feeling an ache she hadn't let herself acknowledge in months. She was not the first woman to be left behind, to stand alone in the shadows, clutching at fading memories and wishing for a miracle. As the rain picked up, Sable stepped closer, her warm breath on Caroline's face, a grounding presence in the swirl of grief and longing. But the letters held more than pain. In one, Mary wrote, "If ever you return, follow the promise I kept beneath the oak. You'll know it by the silver horse." The words snagged in Caroline's mind, lighting up a fresh thread of curiosity. What had Mary hidden here? Was there more than just heartbreak buried in the wet Kentucky soil? A sudden shout startled her. Caroline jerked up, clutching the box tight. But it was only Mrs. Conway, her elderly neighbor, waving from the fence line, concern etched on her weathered face. "You all right over there?" Caroline nodded, holding the box behind her back. "Just cleaning up after the storm," she called, her voice shaky. Mrs. Conway eyed her, then glanced at Sable, who stood like a sentinel between the women and the tree. The old woman hesitated, then turned and shuffled back toward her own porch. Caroline exhaled, her heart slowing. She was glad for the solitude. There were things here she needed to face on her own. With shaking hands, she tucked the letters, photograph, and brooch back into the metal box, closing the lid with a click that seemed to echo beneath the tree's spreading limbs. She felt watched, not just by Sable, but by the weight of history itself. Decades of secrets pressing down, begging to be told. As she rose to leave, a patch of muddy straw caught her eye, disturbed by the digging. Bending down, she uncovered a second, smaller tin, almost missed in the rush. Inside was a single folded note, the handwriting different, elegant, looping. It read, "A promise kept beneath the oak. For the one who seeks, there is always more. Let the past lead you home." Caroline shivered, the words curling around her heart like a question and an answer all at once. She trudged back to the barn, Sable trailing close. Inside, the world felt changed, charged with old longing and the certainty that she had stepped into a story much bigger than her own. As she set the boxes on her kitchen table, rain still tapping at the windows, Caroline realized she was no longer simply searching for answers. She was part of a chain, reaching back through years of hope, fear, and love. The past was awake now, and it would not be ignored. Sunday arrived wrapped in endless rain, the sky a curtain of gray that pressed against the farmhouse and muffled every sound. Caroline's eyes felt gritty and raw, the weight of the past 2 days heavy on her shoulders. She moved through her morning routine as if underwater, coffee left to go cold on the counter, toast untouched, her mind circling the metal box and its fragile contents sitting at the edge of the kitchen table. Eventually, she carried the box out to the barn, unable to shake the pull it had on her. The familiar scent of hay and leather was grounding, the gentle shuffle of Sable in her stall a welcome reminder of the present. Caroline settled onto a bale of straw with the box in her lap, rain beating a slow, hypnotic rhythm on the roof overhead. The barn was dim, safe, apart from the world, but alive with memory. She pulled out the letters and the photograph, spreading them across her knees. The faces stared up at her. Elliot in his crisp uniform, Mary's looping words filled with longing and hope that felt as immediate as her own aching chest. For a long time, Caroline simply sat and read, letting the story seep into her bones. Mary's sleepless nights, the ache of waiting for a letter, the way hope and fear could become indistinguishable after so many months alone. Caroline understood it, the way loneliness could transform from a sharp pain to a constant background hum, always there, coloring every thought. As she read, Sable shifted closer, her warm, solid presence pressing into Caroline's side. The horse nudged her gently, lowering her big head until her muzzle rested on Caroline's knee. Caroline smiled despite herself. "You feel it too, don't you?" she whispered, running her fingers over the velvety curve of Sable's cheek. Sable made a soft sound and settled in, her breathing deep and steady. A sudden memory washed over Caroline. Her own nights waiting for a voice, a call, some sign that she was wanted, needed, remembered. She remembered the ache when her ex-husband's words grew cold, how the rooms of the house had started to feel too large, too empty. Now, sitting with Sable and these echoes of another time, she wondered if every generation was fated to battle the same ghosts, just in different shapes. One letter in particular caught her eye. Mary describing the old oak tree as a place of solace, a living monument to promises and longing. "The tree holds the key to homecoming," Mary had written. Caroline read those words over and over, her mind spinning with questions. Was it just a metaphor, or something more? The night before, she had found the brooch, the photograph, and that strange, looping note. Each clue felt intentional, as if Mary had planted them not just for Elliot, but for someone, anyone, who might someday need to find their way home. Sable nudged Caroline again, this time brushing away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. Caroline laughed, a soft, broken sound, and wrapped her arms around the horse's neck, burying her face in Sable's warm coat. "You're a good listener, you know that," she murmured. Sable's only answer was a gentle sigh, her breath fanning across Caroline's skin. For a long time, Caroline just sat with her grief, letting it move through her instead of pushing it down. The rain outside was relentless, drumming on the metal roof. But inside the barn, time felt different. She could almost imagine Mary sitting where she was now, pouring out her heart onto paper, trusting that someone, Elliot, or even a stranger, would someday understand. A sudden sound, a tap at the barn door, made her startle. Caroline tensed, but it was only the wind, rattling the latch. Still, the sensation that she was being watched lingered. She remembered the words from the Historical Society's letter, tucked among Mary's notes. "The tree holds the key to homecoming." Had they known about the box, the brooch, or was this just one of those strange coincidences, life echoing back on itself in ways no one could explain? Caroline reached for the faded photograph, tracing Elliot's features with her thumb. He looked so young, so certain. She tried to imagine the world as it must have been then. War, distance, the threat of losing everything you loved. She wondered what promises he had made under the oak, and whether he'd kept them. Had he returned to Mary, or had he become just another story lost to time and silence? Sable shifted again, drawing Caroline back from her thoughts. The horse pressed her head into Caroline's lap, staying still as Caroline stroked her mane. "I'm glad you're here with me," Caroline whispered, her words barely more than a breath. Rain continued to pour down, turning the world outside to a blur. Inside the barn, Caroline felt the first stirrings of something like hope, a quiet certainty that she was not as lost or as alone as she had believed. The past was speaking, and for the first time in a long while, she was ready to listen. Later that afternoon, as the rain slowed to a mist, Caroline returned to the house, her arms full of letters and questions. The note from the Historical Society replayed in her mind. The tree holds the key. She glanced out the window at the old oak, standing guard at the edge of her property. She didn't know what secrets it still held, but she was determined to find out. For now, though, she let herself rest, Sable close, the letters on the table, and the knowledge that sometimes the only way forward was through the tangled, unfinished business of memory. The rain finally eased, leaving the world washed clean, the fields shimmering with puddles that reflected a cold blue sky. That night, the farmhouse felt even quieter than usual, as if the storm had swept away the last traces of noise and distraction. Caroline paced the kitchen, unable to settle, her mind swirling with fragments of Mary's letters and the cryptic messages about the oak tree. Every time she looked out the window, her eyes were drawn to that silhouette at the edge of the yard, the ancient oak, roots twisting into the earth, limbs reaching for secrets only the wind remembered. Sleep came in snatches. Caroline drifted in and out, dreams blurring with memories. She was standing by the tree in the pouring rain, clutching a photograph to her chest, her heart hammering as thunder cracked above. Then, without warning, she was a child again, safe in her father's arms, listening to his stories about the land and the horses that had once run wild here. In every dream, Sable was there, sometimes just a shadow, sometimes a solid presence standing guard at her side. Sable's image lingered when she woke, the sense of being watched, protected, clinging to her long after the dream faded. Caroline rolled out of bed and pressed her forehead to the cold window pane. The tree was still there, unchanged, and yet she felt a strange certainty. Something was waiting for her beneath those branches. She needed answers. But the truth was, she was afraid, not of ghosts, but of moving on, of letting go of the pain that had anchored her for so long. She remembered Mary's longing, the desperate hope in her letters. It was easier to hold on to hurt than to step into an uncertain future. Sable seemed to sense her hesitation, whinnying softly from the barn as dawn crept over the horizon. Later that morning, after feeding Sable and mucking out the stalls, Caroline found herself at her neighbor's fence, fingers curled around the old wood, the cold biting at her skin. Mrs. Conway stood on her porch, wrapped in a faded plaid shawl, eyes sharp beneath snowy hair. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," Mrs. Conway called. Caroline managed a tired smile. "Guess I've had a lot on my mind." Mrs. Conway stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Is it about the oak? Folks say it's haunted, you know." Caroline hesitated. For years, she'd kept her troubles to herself, swallowing her fear and loneliness, pretending she was stronger than she felt. But something about the old woman's gaze, steady, unflinching, made her want to tell the truth. "I found some old letters buried by the tree," Caroline admitted. "From the war. They belonged to a woman named Mary. She was waiting for someone who never came home." Mrs. Conway's face softened, her eyes distant. "There are a lot of stories buried around here," she said quietly. "Some are better left alone, but some need to come into the light." Caroline nodded. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel like I belong anywhere again." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind sighing through the fence rails. Then Mrs. Conway reached into her pocket and pulled out a tarnished brass key, heavy and worn with age. "My father found this by the tree back in 1964, she said, pressing it into Caroline's palm. "He always said it was meant for someone who needed it. Maybe that someone is you." Caroline turned the key over, her pulse quickening. The metal was cold, inscribed with delicate scrolling she could barely make out. She closed her fingers around it and looked up, but Mrs. Conway was already heading back to her porch, her shawl flapping like a flag in the breeze. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Caroline cleaned the barn, sorted through the muddy letters, and tried to ignore the sense of anticipation tightening in her chest. She told herself she was being silly, that the key was nothing more than a piece of junk. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something she didn't yet understand. That night, a restless energy gripped her. She fell into bed exhausted, but the dreams came back, vivid, unsettling. In them she wandered the fields, calling out for someone she couldn't name, always returning to the oak tree, always finding Sable standing watch, calm and unyielding. A crash jolted her awake. Caroline blinked in the darkness, heart pounding. For a moment, she thought she'd dreamed it, but then she heard it again, the distinct sound of hooves thudding against wood. She grabbed her flashlight and pulled on her boots, every sense on high alert. The barn was dark and quiet, the smell of hay sharp in the cold air. Sable stood by the window, her body rigid, ears pointed toward the yard. Caroline followed her gaze, shivering. Beyond the glass, the oak tree loomed, bathed in pale moonlight. Sable stamped her hoof and snorted, eyes fixed on the branches as if she could see something, or someone Caroline could not. Caroline laid a hand on Sable's neck. "What is it, girl?" she whispered. The mare didn't move. For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, watching the tree together. As the hours crept by, the sense of being watched faded, replaced by a quiet certainty that Sable was standing guard not just over the farm, but over something older, something that wanted to be found. The brass key burned in Caroline's pocket, heavy with promise. Back inside, she tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sable by the window, alert and waiting. She felt the story pulling her forward, toward the oak, toward whatever secrets waited in the cold Kentucky soil. For the first time in years, Caroline didn't feel quite so afraid. Morning brought a sharp frost, the ground crisp under Caroline's boots as she stepped outside. She slipped the brass key into her pocket, its weight a constant reminder. The sky was pale and streaked with sunlight, but an uneasy chill still hovered in the air. Sable waited by the fence, her brown eyes tracking Caroline's every movement. The sense of purpose Caroline felt was both exhilarating and terrifying. This time she wouldn't let doubt stop her. She would see the mystery through, wherever it led. She made her way to the ancient oak, the grass slick with dew and the air thick with silence. Every step felt heavier, as if she were wading through decades of secrets. The key pressed into her palm as she knelt by the gnarled roots, her breath clouding in the morning air. She remembered Mary's words, "The tree holds the key to homecoming." Caroline ran her hands over the bark, searching for anything out of place. After a few moments, her fingers found a hollow, small, just wide enough for the key. Heart racing, she slid the key into the opening and turned. There was a faint click, and a piece of bark swung aside to reveal a narrow cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a tin box, smaller and older than the first, and beneath it, a folded map yellowed with age. Caroline swallowed, pulling both from the hollow. The tin was locked tight, but the key turned in it smoothly. She opened it to find a handful of dog tags, a faded photograph of several men and horses gathered outside a crumbling barn, and a neatly folded note. "Remember the places that kept us safe. Trust the guardians." Unfolding the map, Caroline saw a series of hand-drawn circles marked across Lexington, the oak tree's location at the center. One circle was drawn thick and dark, a spot at the edge of town labeled Harmon's Stable. Another mark near the river read simply, Safe House. She felt a cold tingle on her skin. It wasn't just about Mary and Elliot. This was bigger, a web of places, perhaps people tied together by the old oak and whatever had happened here during the war. A sudden rustling behind her made her jump. Sable tensed, moving in front of Caroline with her head high and her body blocking the newcomer from view. Caroline turned, her pulse hammering, to see a man standing at the fence line, his hands in his pockets, his expression wary but curious. He looked to be in his late 40s, with wind-burned skin and a tired set to his shoulders. "That's private property, you know," he called, not unkindly, but with an edge that made Caroline straighten. "I know," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "I live here. Can I help you?" He hesitated, his eyes darting between Caroline and Sable. "Name's Will Harmon. My grandfather used to own this land before it changed hands after the war. I come by every now and then, just to check." Something in his tone made Caroline's guard go up. She rose to her feet, the tin and map clutched tight in her hands. "I've been finding things," she said quietly. "Letters, photographs, things buried near the oak." "Did your family—" Will's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no hostility, just a guarded pain, as if he too was carrying the weight of secrets. "Granddad never talked much about the war, or what he left behind. But I know he and some of the other men kept things hidden, for safekeeping. My mother always said there was more to this place than people wanted to admit." He stepped closer, but Sable moved between them, planting her hooves in the mud and lowering her head protectively. Caroline found herself smiling, a thin, nervous smile. "It's all right, girl," she said, placing a calming hand on Sable's shoulder. "He's not here to hurt us." Will's posture softened. "That's a good horse. Reminds me of one my granddad had, a mare named Lila, always getting between him and trouble." Caroline relaxed a little, curiosity taking the place of fear. She held out the map. "Do you recognize any of these places?" Will studied it, brow furrowed. "Some of them, yeah. The stable, Harmon's Stable, was my grandfather's. It was used by the army during the war, and for a while after. People said it was haunted, but it was just a good hiding spot for men coming home. The Safe House, that was a place on the river, a stop for folks passing through, or laying low when things got rough." Caroline's mind spun with possibilities. What else was hidden in those places? What did the dog tags, the letters, the brooches all mean? Before she could ask, Will cleared his throat. "Listen. Some people in town won't want you digging into this. They're proud, but also scared, afraid of old shame coming back, or secrets they'd rather keep buried." She nodded, understanding more than she could say. "I'm not looking to hurt anyone. I want to know the truth." Will considered her, then nodded. "If you're serious, go to the stable. Look for a loose stone in the northwest wall. That's where Granddad said he kept things safe when he thought the world was ending. But be careful. Not everyone wants old ghosts disturbed." He turned and walked away, leaving Caroline standing in the cold with Sable pressed close. She watched him disappear down the lane, questions buzzing in her mind. For the first time since all this began, she realized she was not alone in her search. The past had many guardians, and she was just the latest to follow their trail. She looked down at Sable, running her hand through the mare's damp mane. "Well, girl, looks like we're in it together now," she whispered. As the wind picked up, rattling the branches of the oak, Caroline felt a mix of fear and excitement. The path ahead was uncertain, tangled in history and secrecy. But with Sable at her side and a map to guide her, she was ready to face whatever shadows waited in the hidden places of Lexington. Tomorrow, she would go to the stable. Tonight, she let herself hope. The next morning dawned cold and windless, the kind of Kentucky winter day where breath hung in the air and every sound seemed sharper against the quiet. Caroline woke before sunrise, the map spread across her kitchen table and the contents of the tin laid out in careful order. Dog tags, faded photos, that cryptic note about guardians, and the brooch gleaming in the pale light. All of it whispered of things half-remembered and waiting to be found. She packed her satchel with the map, the letters, and a thermos of coffee, then pulled on her thickest coat and boots. Sable was waiting by the fence, stamping the ground with nervous energy, as if she too could sense the importance of what they were about to do. Caroline stroked the mare's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin. "Let's go, girl. We've got a stable to find," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The journey to the old Harmon stable was longer than she'd anticipated. The road was slick with frost, the world hushed and expectant. Sable's hooves struck sparks off the gravel as they moved through the outskirts of town, passing fields gone fallow for winter, barns leaning into the wind, and the occasional early riser who watched them with wary curiosity. Caroline kept her eyes on the horizon, the map clutched in her pocket, each step forward tightening the knot of anticipation in her chest. When she finally saw the stable, half hidden behind a tangle of wild rose bushes and bare sycamores, she felt her breath catch. It was a relic, wood gone gray and splintered, roof sagging under the weight of years, windows empty and dark. The place looked abandoned, but as they approached, Sable's ears flicked forward, alert and watchful. Caroline tethered Sable by a patch of stubborn grass and walked to the northwest wall, the directions from Will still echoing in her mind. The stonework was rough, mortared in haste, but after a few minutes of searching she found it. A single stone just slightly out of place, marked with a faint scratch that looked almost like an H. Her hands shook as she pried it loose, heart pounding, half expecting someone to shout, or the world to change. Behind the stone was a hollow just big enough for a small journal, wrapped in oilcloth, and something else. A child's wooden horse, carved and worn smooth by decades of handling. Caroline stared at the toy, a surge of unexpected tenderness swelling in her chest. She pulled out the journal and the horse, cradling them in her arms, then quickly replaced the stone and hurried back inside the stable. Inside, the air was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of mold and dust. Slivers of light fell through the broken roof, illuminating drifts of straw and long-forgotten tack. Caroline sat on an overturned bucket and carefully unwrapped the journal. The first page was brittle, but the handwriting was neat. The ink faded to brown. January 1945. We hide where we can. Mary's husband brought news tonight. Soldiers are coming home, some wounded, some lost. Harmon says we must keep the doors open, keep the horses ready. There's talk of coded messages, a network through the fields, and a hope that not every secret is lost. Caroline read on, her pulse quickening as the story unfolded. The journal told of families who had risked everything to shelter returning soldiers, men too wounded or haunted to go home, women who had lost husbands and sons but still offered food and comfort, a town where silence and courage walked hand in hand. Names leapt from the pages: Elliot Harmon, Mary, others whose stories had faded from the world but lived here, between the lines. In the margin of one page, a short sentence in German, carefully inked: Bewahre das Gedächtnis. Caroline stared at it, her high school German coming back in bits and pieces. Keep the memory. She shivered, the words carrying more weight than she could explain. Sable's hoof clattered against the stable floor, snapping Caroline out of her reverie. She looked up and saw the mare pawing at the straw, as if searching for something. Caroline stood and crossed to Sable, crouching down to help. Together they dug through the moldy straw and splinters until Sable's hoof struck wood. Buried beneath years of dust was another photograph. This one so faded she had to hold it to the light to see. It showed Elliot Harmon, younger than in the first photo, standing with a broad-shouldered brown mare. So like Sable it made Caroline's heart ache. Written on the back, Sable 1944, guardian and friend. She stared at the name, realization dawning. Sable wasn't just a horse's name. It was a code name, passed down through generations. In the journal, tucked between pages, she found a list of dates and names, each one marked Sable beside it. Horses that had stood watch through wars and peace, always appearing when memories were threatened, when stories risked being lost. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes, not just from sadness, but from the strange, fierce joy of connection. The brown mare she'd rescued wasn't an accident. She was the latest in a long line of guardians, a living thread that tied Caroline to the past, to Mary and Elliot, to every lost and found soul who had crossed this land. She pressed her forehead to Sable's neck, breathing in the earthy scent of horse and straw. "You were meant to find me," she whispered, voice thick. Outside, the wind rattled the stable doors, but inside, for the first time, Caroline felt anchored. She tucked the journal, the wooden horse, and the photograph into her satchel, then stood beside Sable, her resolve hardening. The truth was out there, buried in the bones of the land and the hearts of those who remembered. As she led Sable out of the stable, the sky split with sunlight, casting long shadows across the fields. Caroline knew there would be resistance. Old secrets were dangerous things. But with Sable at her side, and the past finally speaking, she was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed blurred into a haze of research, restless nights, and careful steps through the small town that now felt as full of secrets as it did familiar faces. Caroline spent her evenings poring over the journal and photographs, the coded message still echoing in her mind. Keep the memory. She'd written it out on scraps of paper, circled it in her notebook, even traced it into the dust on her kitchen counter, as if by repeating it enough she could unlock something hidden in her own memory. Sable was never far, standing watch near the barn or pressing her nose to the kitchen window, a silent presence bridging past and present. But the deeper Caroline dug, the more resistance she met. She'd started discreet conversations at the feed store, the library, even during Sunday service, sharing bits of what she'd found and asking gentle questions about the Harmon family, the old stable, and anyone who might remember the war years. Some people listened, eyes widening in curiosity or nostalgia, but others stiffened, glancing away or changing the subject with awkward haste. A few older townsfolk grew openly hostile, as if the past was a wound better left undisturbed. Word got out faster than she expected. By midweek, she received a call from the local paper, a woman named Gina asking for an interview. Caroline hesitated, heart thumping. She wasn't sure she was ready to speak publicly, to risk being judged or dismissed. But as she watched Sable grazing in the muddy paddock, she realized she'd already crossed a line. She couldn't go back. So she said yes. The town hall was packed that Thursday night. More people than Caroline had ever seen gathered in one place since the 4th of July parade. Rain streaked the windows, thunder muttering in the distance as Caroline stepped up to the front with Sable's photograph and the journal clutched to her chest. For a moment, her hands trembled so badly she thought she might drop everything right there. Sable, brought inside by special request, stood just behind her, calm and massive and unblinking. She cleared her throat. "I know some of you have heard what I've been working on," she began, voice thin. "I found letters and photographs buried on my property. I think they belong to Mary and Elliot Harmon, my neighbor's family. There are journals, records, and a map with places around Lexington. I believe these are pieces of our community's history, and I think it's important that we remember what really happened here." There was a heavy silence. Caroline glanced at the crowd, faces closed, skeptical, some sympathetic. She pressed on, telling them about the secret network the journal described, about families who sheltered returning soldiers, about the code names and the horses called Sable, guardians of memory. Someone in the back scoffed. "Stories are just stories. That old tree's been around since before my granddad was born. You think digging up ghosts will help anybody?" A ripple of murmurs followed, some agreeing, others uncertain. Caroline swallowed, feeling her fear surge up, but Sable shifted, coming to stand at her shoulder, pressing close until Caroline felt the heat of her body, the rhythm of her breath, the memory of Mary's longing, the coded note. "Keep the memory," rose in Caroline's chest like a battle cry. She steadied herself. "We can't move forward if we pretend the past never happened," she said, her voice stronger now. "These stories of courage, of helping those in need, of making mistakes and making amends, they belong to all of us. If we're brave enough to listen, maybe we can heal together." The crowd was restless, divided. An older man in a World War II veteran's cap pushed himself up from his chair, leaning hard on a cane. The room quieted. "I was there," he said, his voice rough with age. "Not at Harmon's stable, but I remember coming home, broken up inside. It was the horses that calmed me down. Folks like Mary Harmon and her husband helped more men than you know, and they did it because it was right, not because they wanted a medal." He shuffled forward, placing a trembling hand on Caroline's journal. "There's a stone wall by the river, carved with the initials of those who made it home. Most folks forgot. I never did." Tears pricked Caroline's eyes. The spell was broken. Suddenly, others were speaking up. An old woman with memories of hiding neighbors during the draft, a middle-aged man whose father had worked at the stables as a boy. Some were still angry, fearful that family secrets would be exposed, but others nodded, their faces softening as old griefs were shared out loud for the first time in decades. Gina from the paper raised her hand. "If there's a wall with names, can we go see it? Maybe document what's there. Make it part of the historical record." Caroline nodded, hope and relief surging through her. "We should. Everyone deserves to know the truth." After the meeting, people gathered around her in small clusters, sharing scraps of stories, faded photographs, and promises to look for anything that might help. Sable stood among them like a living bridge, children stroking her muzzle and veterans patting her strong shoulder, as if by touching her they might touch something sacred and unbroken. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Caroline lingered in the empty hall. Sable stood by her side, patient and calm. Caroline ran her fingers through the mare's mane, feeling gratitude, pride, and a bone-deep sense of responsibility. The old veteran joined her, placing a shaky hand on her arm. "You did good tonight. Don't let them scare you off. Sometimes the only way to heal is to shine a light, no matter how much it hurts." He pressed a slip of paper into her palm, a final clue. directions to the stone wall by the river. Caroline closed her eyes, breathing in the moment. For the first time, the truth didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a door opening. Sable snorted, nudging Caroline's shoulder, ready for whatever came next. Morning broke with a pale sun, thin light glinting on frost still clinging to the fence posts and bare branches. Caroline hadn't slept much, her mind replaying the town hall, the faces she'd seen, some open, some still wary, and the trembling voice of the old veteran who'd given her the directions. The paper with his careful scrawl felt almost sacred in her hand as she left the farmhouse, Sable trailing close behind, their breath steaming in the cold air. She met Will Harmon at the edge of town, near the old stone bridge that arched over the river. Others from the community were already there, a few familiar from the meeting, others drawn by curiosity, by rumor, or by something deeper and unspoken. No one said much. The group made its way in silence along the riverbank, boots crunching in the frozen grass, Sable's hooves sure and steady beside Caroline. The wall was half hidden by brambles and weeds, low and weathered, its stones thick with moss. At first glance, it looked like any other forgotten boundary in rural Kentucky. But as the group cleared away the overgrowth, initials and dates emerged. Dozens of them, some nearly worn away, others sharp and fresh as if chiseled only yesterday. Caroline knelt, her fingers tracing the grooves in the stone. EH 1945, MH 1944, and below them names she recognized from Mary's letters and the journal. Men and women who had risked everything, whose stories had been locked away in silence and fear. Sable stood quietly, watching over the gathering as if she understood the gravity of the moment. The others moved closer, forming a loose circle around the wall. Someone found a rusted latch set deep into the stones. With careful hands, Caroline pried it open, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. She reached inside and felt the rough edge of a wooden chest, cold and splintery. With Will's help, she slid it out onto the grass. The lid groaned as she lifted it. Inside lay a treasure trove of memory. War medals, faded letters wrapped in oilskin, a locket holding a photograph of a young woman and a cavalryman. Mary and Elliot, young and hopeful. There were ration books, a child's crumpled drawing of a horse, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope addressed in an elegant hand to the keepers of tomorrow. Caroline's fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, written in flowing script, was a note from Elliot. To those who find this, remember us, not for the battles we fought, but for the hope we carried home. May this place remain a haven for memory and for healing. Tell our stories. Remember the guardians who kept us safe. If you do, we are never truly lost. She read the letter aloud, her voice breaking, and all around her the crowd listened in silence. Some wept quietly, elders recognizing family names, younger people realizing the weight of what had been hidden here. Will knelt beside her, eyes bright with tears, and gently took the locket, turning it over in his hands. A sense of unity swept through the group. The old grievances and silent wounds, so long hidden, seemed to lift, replaced by something fierce and tender, a pride in what their community had endured and the courage it had taken to protect each other. We should do something with this place, someone murmured. Make it a memorial, so nobody ever forgets. Others quickly agreed, voices rising with purpose. Plans took shape in bursts, clearing the wall, planting a new oak tree beside the river, building benches, setting up a plaque with the names found in the journal and on the wall. Caroline felt herself swept along, not as an outsider, but as part of something larger than herself. As the sun climbed higher, The group got to work. Shovels flashed in the cold light. Hands joined to pull weeds and clear brush. Children made a game of gathering stones to line the path, their laughter sharp and bright against the quiet reverence of the adults. Someone brought out a battered radio, playing old war songs and bluegrass tunes, and before long, the mood was transformed, sorrow and pride woven together in the work of remembrance. Caroline moved among them, the chest of artifacts open at her feet. She saw people trading stories, passing the medals and letters gently from hand to hand. Sable became the heart of the gathering, children braiding her mane with wildflowers, veterans stroking her muzzle, sharing memories of other brown mares who had stood watch over frightened men in dark barns. As afternoon faded into gold, Caroline gathered everyone near the wall. She held up Elliot's note and spoke from her heart, her words flowing easily now. This history belongs to all of us. By remembering, by telling these stories, we give new meaning to everything that's come before, and everything still to come. Let's promise each other that the lessons we find here won't be lost again. The townsfolk murmured their agreement. Tears and smiles mingled freely as people hugged, shook hands, and pressed small tokens, stones, pressed flowers, a child's drawing, into the crevices of the wall. A few knelt in prayer, others simply sat in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle around them. As dusk fell and the sky flushed pink and violet, Caroline stepped back to take it all in. Sable stood beside her, calm and radiant, the last light of day shining in her eyes. The old wounds of the town felt less sharp, transformed by the work of many hands and the courage to face the truth. Caroline realized that healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about honoring it, making space for both sorrow and hope to live side by side. As long as the wall stood, as long as the stories were told, the legacy would endure, not just in stone and memory, but in every act of kindness, every bond of trust, every new beginning. The community had come together, and together they had found a way to let the past become a source of strength. The riverbank was awash with gentle sunlight, the kind that filtered through new leaves and caught on the smooth stones of the memorial wall. It was the first Sunday since the site had been transformed, a day set aside for dedication and reflection. Townsfolk gathered in clusters, their voices hushed, each person carrying their own private bundle of memories and questions. Caroline stood near the podium, her hands trembling not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility and gratitude. Sable waited just behind her, a calm sentinel, her brown eyes absorbing everything with a steady, ancient patience. She looked out across the assembled faces, children fidgeting with bouquets of wildflowers, teenagers clustered at the back, whispering to one another, elders sitting upright, hands folded, eyes shining with tears they didn't bother to hide. There were neighbors she'd barely spoken to, old friends who had drifted apart, and people she'd once feared would judge her. Yet, in this space, the boundaries seemed to blur. Caroline realized how interconnected their lives really were, how the secrets of one family became the burdens or the blessings of another, how the courage and kindness of the past rippled forward in ways no one could predict. The ceremony began with music. An old bluegrass tune played soft and slow, echoing off the river. As the last notes faded, Caroline took a steadying breath and stepped up to the microphone, Sable's gentle presence at her back giving her strength. She began, "When I first came here, I thought I was alone. I was running from pain, from memories, from the idea that maybe I'd failed at something essential. But this land had other ideas. The letters, the journals, the tree, the secrets buried in this earth. They weren't just about the past. They were about all of us, about what happens when we let silence grow too deep, when we hide our wounds instead of healing them together. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, catching the eyes of a young boy in the front row, wide-eyed and solemn. Mary and Elliot's story was never just theirs. It was written into these stones, into the names and initials you see here. It's in every family who lost someone, who found someone, who dared to hope for more. When we uncovered these memories, we weren't just digging up old grief. We were making room for healing. She paused, feeling the attention of every person, every living thing around her. The wind rustling the grass, Sable shifting quietly, birdsong threading through the quiet. Caroline continued, her voice growing stronger. Pain grows in silence. We all know that. I tried to carry mine alone, and it nearly broke me. But when I started to share it, when I let myself be seen, when I listened to your stories too, I learned something important. Real healing doesn't come from pretending everything is fine. It comes from facing the truth, together. It comes from listening to the pain of others, from making space for sorrow and for hope in equal measure. She glanced at Sable, resting just behind her. Some of you might say she's just a horse, but Sable has been more than that. She's been a companion, a bridge to the past, a guardian of memory. I think animals, like people, can help us carry things too heavy to bear alone. They remind us that sometimes comfort is found in quiet presence, in gentle eyes and steady hearts. Caroline looked back to the crowd. She saw faces transformed, children who looked up at her with awe, elders who wiped at their cheeks, neighbors who stood a little closer than they had before. The stories of Mary and Elliot, of hidden networks and brave choices, show us that what matters most isn't what we build in stone or metal, but what we carry forward in kindness and courage. The legacy of this place isn't a secret anymore. It's a lesson that every act of bravery, every small kindness, ripples outwards. That when we face the truth, even if it's hard, we make room for new beginnings. She paused as the children came forward with wildflowers, laying them gently along the wall. The air was thick with the scent of earth and green things, the sound of quiet weeping and murmured prayers. As the ceremony closed, Caroline invited everyone to step up and trace a name or initial into a book that would remain at the memorial, a living record for future generations. We're all guardians now, she said, keepers of these stories. As long as we remember, as long as we share, nothing and no one is ever truly lost. One by one, people came, some shy, some bold. Each person found a place on the wall to touch, to linger, to remember. As they did, Caroline noticed how the burden she'd carried for so long had changed. It wasn't lighter exactly, but it was shared. She saw it in the way people looked at each other, in the tentative smiles, the hands grasped in sudden solidarity. At the end, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the grass, Caroline returned to Sable's side. She rested her hand on the mare's strong neck and looked out over the river. She thought of Mary, waiting under the old oak, and Elliot, carrying hope home. She thought of her own journey, the fear, the loneliness, the risk it took to let others in. She whispered, "We did it, girl. We really did." Sable snorted softly, almost as if in reply. And as the townsfolk slowly drifted away, their hearts a little lighter and their stories now forever entwined, Caroline knew that the true lesson written in stone was simple and profound. By facing the past together, they had finally begun to heal, and in that healing, found the strength to hope again. The sun sank behind the new oak tree, golden light filtering through its young leaves and painting long shadows over the riverbank. The old stone wall, once choked by weeds and silence, now stood transformed, a living memorial draped with garlands of wildflowers and tokens left by the people of Lexington. Children played nearby, their laughter carried on the breeze, while elders sat on newly built benches, their faces soft with memory and peace. The site had changed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. Where once there had been division and unspoken sorrow, there was now unity, pride, and the gentle murmur of shared stories. Caroline sat quietly at the memorial's edge, Sable at her side. She watched a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8, clutching a smooth stone to her chest, her lips pressed into a worried line. The child glanced over at Caroline, hesitant, and then shuffled closer, her eyes shining with the pain of questions too big for her small frame. "My daddy was a soldier," the girl said softly. "He doesn't come home much anymore." Caroline's heart twisted. She reached out, letting her hand rest gently on Sable's withers. "You know, when I was feeling sad, I would talk to Sable. Horses are the best listeners. They don't rush you, and they never judge. You want to give it a try?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. She stepped forward and pressed her cheek to Sable's neck, whispering secrets only the horse could hear. Sable stood motionless, eyes half closed, her breathing deep and calm. When the girl pulled away, she managed a small smile. The weight on her shoulders eased, if only a little. "You can always come talk to her," Caroline said, her own voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes, letting your feelings out is the bravest thing you can do." As evening settled in, families gathered for a candlelight vigil. Each person came forward with a stone, a flower, or a memento, some inscribed with names, others with lessons learned or hopes for the future. They placed these tokens along the wall, their hands lingering in silent prayer or whispered gratitude. The flickering candlelight danced over the stone, illuminating every scar and groove, every carved initial and newly etched name. It was a mosaic of memory, messy, imperfect, and undeniably human. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the community move together in solemn grace. She remembered her own first night here, the storm raging outside, the emptiness that seemed to swallow her whole. She thought of Mary and Elliot, of all the guardians who had come before, of the choices that had rippled through generations to bring her, and everyone gathered here to this moment. She stood before the wall, her hands trembling not with fear, but with gratitude and responsibility. Sable stood just behind her, calm and alert, her presence a living link to the past and a symbol of hope for the future. Caroline spoke softly, her voice carrying across the crowd. "I used to believe that strength meant keeping everything inside, never letting anyone see you cry. But I learned that true strength comes from opening up, from reaching out, and letting others help you heal. That's what this place is about. It's about remembering, about letting go of shame, and about building something new, together." She looked into the faces before her, children wide-eyed with curiosity, elders wiping away tears, neighbors she'd once feared would judge her now standing side by side. The legacy we leave isn't just in medals or monuments. It's in the stories we tell, the compassion we show, and the promises we keep to each other. As long as we keep telling our stories, as long as we listen, we'll never truly be alone. The candles flickered in the gathering dusk. One by one, people pressed their hands to the wall, tracing names and initials, making their own silent vows. Sable stood quietly beside Caroline, the horse's gentle strength grounding her. As the vigil ended, the crowd lingered, reluctant to let go of the moment. Elders traded tales, some laughing, some weeping. Children darted in and out of the circle, leaving wildflowers at Sable's feet. The old wounds of the town, betrayals, regrets, lost dreams, felt lighter, transformed by the courage it had taken to face them. No one had to carry their burdens alone anymore. When the last candle guttered out, Caroline stayed behind. She sat on the bench beside the new oak, Sable lowering her head to nuzzle Caroline's shoulder. The silence was full, not empty, the kind of peace that comes after the storm has finally passed. She watched the river for a while, letting her thoughts drift. She remembered Eliot's words, "May this place remain a haven for memory and for healing. Tell our stories. Remember the guardians who kept us safe. If you do, we are never truly lost." She knew now what she needed to do. She would keep telling these stories, at the memorial, in the farmhouse, to anyone who would listen. She would urge others to do the same, to break the silence and let healing in. In this way, every wound could become a seed for hope. Caroline rose, pressing her palm to the trunk of the new oak, a promise silent but fierce. "Let's never let history or hurt go unspoken," she whispered. "Let's honor the guardians who stand with us, in the darkest nights and the brightest days. And most of all, let's keep sharing our stories, because in the telling, we find meaning. In the listening, we find each other." As she turned to go, Sable followed, her silhouette tall and steady against the fading sky. The memorial glowed softly in the moonlight, no longer just a place of memory, but a source of hope, a testament to ordinary people becoming guardians of something extraordinary. The story would continue, and as long as even one person remembered, it would never truly end.